COVID pandemic, and also to see the conformity of those credit operations guaranteed by the government, which guarantees these investment funds. This operational auditing, like I mentioned, seeks to put a summary framework that should be sent to the Congress, and this operational auditing should be doing 2 stages, and will seek to subsidize the discussion, including of the projects for an annual budget, as well as having as main focus of checking the results of these programs in this area, and if the resources that were allocated reach their objectives. So it's very opportune to highlight how this brilliant event, with the initial landmark of operational auditing, that these programs were designed within an emergency aspect to economic help during the COVID pandemic, but PRONAMP will come as a permanent program in credit to small and medium companies. And this shows the importance of this event. It's also important to highlight that these Brazilian programs should be aligned with the best practices at the international level, be it in governance and management. So with these words, I would like once more to congratulate those who organized the event in the certainty that it will reach fully its objectives, and especially in inaugurating the operational auditing and calling all those present, those institutions to participate together with the TCU, with our external control secretariat, in conducting this operational auditing, presenting suggestions, bringing ideas and new elements. I declare the opening of this international webinar on credit guarantee for small and medium-sized enterprises. In the name of the TCU, thank you very much. We will now hear Adjunct Special Secretary of Productivity, Job and Competitivity of the Ministry of Economy, Mr. Bruno Monteiro Portela. Good morning to all. I hope you can all hear me. Initially, I would like to thank the TCU. It's an honor to participate in this webinar, which is a priority theme here in our secretariat. I would like to greet those presenters, especially Mr. Carvalho, and I would like to greet all civil servants and collaborators of the TCU, which are important for our republic to work. Also, our moderator, Rafael Encimas, Mr. José Fernando Ferreira, the SMEs Secretariat, Stefan Reyes, Mr. Bevillaqua from Sebrae, Thiago Druta, General Coordinator of the Economic Area of the TCU. And finally, a special thanks to Andrea Rocha from the Executive Secretariat of Development, that helped build this event. And initially, it would be talk about CEPEC, is one of the 8 secretariats of the Ministry of Economy. It's the only one that has the 4 ministers, which was planning, job, infrastructure, and finance and economic. They joined in the same, and the various secretariats, and SDIC, together with Ascent, which is for development of innovation in industry, and the Special Secretariat for Small and Medium Enterprises Secretariat. So we have the mission of seeking incessantly, and of course, to help innovation in the productive sector. During the pandemic, we worked very hard in this access to credit for the productive sector, especially for the most critical sectors. And as the theme today, we know that the small and medium enterprises represent 90% of companies, 62% of jobs, and a good part of the GDP. And it's a challenge for us and for us here in the Ministry of the Economy. And it has, in fact, disproportionately those SMEs because they have less credit to access to credit, they have less level of productivity. And according to a survey by Sebrae, what motivated us to improve even more access to credit, only 8% of small company enterprises in the beginning of the pandemic in July had effectively done credit operations. So it was a very concerning data. So from January to December, they had of 290,000 jobs created, which is an important. But the almost 200 jobs were lost for these. 200,000 jobs were lost in those smaller companies. So in the greatest pandemic of the country, we closed the country with 142 new job positions. And according to the data, from 2007 to 2019, so before the pandemic, the SMEs were responsible for 2 million jobs. And the medium and big companies had 1.5 million new jobs. In the first year of the Bolsonaro government, we had 730 new jobs. And the big companies lost 88,000. So 2020, so various SME open. So it does show that there's a small difference, a 0.5% percentage. That's during the pandemic, knowing that 2019 was the best year. We went from 19 to 18, the number of openings as SMEs. So this shows how these SMEs during the pandemic, and it's a relevant data. The CPEC, since 2019, has stimulated the better access to credit, and in 2020 we accelerated this policy due to the pandemic. So we can talk about some of the measures. The federal government adopted a package of measures in over 1 trillion reais to the SMEs. They had deferment of taxes with the Simples Nacional, social security, payment of debits, reduction of work hours, suspension of contracts, emergency help, and credit lines for certain segments. So to help the SMEs, the government adopted a series of measures, which we can highlight PRONAMP, like André de Carvalho mentioned, which became permanent due to its success. And in 2020, we could validate up to 100% of the credit of an operation, which up to 30% of the income of that company. So we extended this and you could parcel it in 36 months. And it was very successful, and we can say why. Only PRONAMP could release more than 37 million, and 8.7 went to SMEs, 8.3 to small companies. This is in over 500,000 operations, and it's a big volume. And in PRONAMP, resources were released in 3 ways. The first, 15.9 million that were consumed in less than a month. In the second transfer, 12 billion. And the last one, 10.9 billion. That's all in 2020. CPEC also released the PEAC, an emergency credit program for small, medium companies, to guarantee those bank guarantees that were demanded when you do loans. In the PEAC, the government also allocated 20 billion, generated 92 billion reais, so thousands of contracts, and we made available credit lines with 40 billion from the PES, which is a program for the support of employment, between those companies between 360,000 and 10 million reais. We launched credit lines with special conditions given by the bank Caixa, 5 billion for agribusiness, 10 billion for cash flow, also for the urban sector employment, BNDES for payments of employees, 5 billion to SMEs, and others more to indirect operations. So joining all of these programs, PES, PRONAMP, PEC Money, CGPE, until 31 of December, we gave credit of 155 billion reais. Of these 155 billion, 94% for maize, which are small and medium, to the SMEs. And this year, in the emergency program that was sanctioned by President Jair Bolsonaro, so the PES has an objective to bring a financial relief to the events sector, which was the one that was most affected by the pandemic, with great impact all over the country, especially emergency help. We also put 15% of those credits, be in volume and quantity, were conceded to this specific sector, 15%. But the law that was sanctioned now destined 20% of the new resources to this PES program. For 2021, we want to reduce the FGO and to increase the leverage through the statute, and we should increase in four times the resources in the FGO to reach the 40 billion from 5 to 20 billion, and all of this destined to the sectors that were hit more critically. Minister André de Carvalho, these are the measures we would expose here to contribute with the panel and the theme in Brazil. We have to advance a lot in terms of access to credit. And thank you once more for the invitation. And in 2021, we will have to focus a lot in these policies. Thank you, and I'm available to all of you. Now with the words, Secretary for External Control and Economic Development of TCU, Mrs. Rafael. Okay, my speech will be very quick because Minister André gave a very good context. I would like to thank the presence of those who will speak today, Special Secretary Bruno Portela, for willing to share his experience in the credit guarantee area. Like Bruno mentioned, the policy of credit, the access to credit is something very relevant, especially for the SMEs. We know it's an important element in Brazil, in the cost Brazil. So the theme is relevant by itself, and during the pandemic, this was even more highlighted. It is fundamental that the government be concerned about access to credit, and so it's in this context that we understand that TCU has to contribute with these policies. So the idea is to contribute to the evaluation of these policies, be it implementation or results, so we can improve the performance of these policies, and to subsidize the National Congress so that Congress might know what worked, what might be improved, so TCU can fulfill its institutional mission in terms of helping public administration. That's it. I would like to thank you, and we're very anxious to hear our specialists from the OECD and the European Association of Guarantee, and I would like to hand over to Rafael, who will moderate.
So now we're going to listen to the advisor of external control of economic development from TCU, Mr. Rafael Encinas, and he's now going to conduct the webinar from this moment on. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your participation. Minister André de Carvalho, Bruno Monteiro Portela from the Ministry of the Economy, I would like to thank all of you for allowing this discussion. So this discussion in Brazil, granting credit, so these programs are extremely relevant for the country, not only in terms of the possibility of Brazil recovering from this pandemic, but also so that it can take a step further and also grant credit to SMEs. And so it's not enough for us to leave the crisis. The country has to develop and also to reach a higher level of employment and develop, etc. So the proposal for this webinar was to share or unite the two international practices and use them in Brazil, because these credit programs, they are not only characteristics of Brazil. They have been adopted all over the world, mainly after the economic crisis of 2008, and many countries started encouraging credit to these SMEs. And the main idea behind these programs is that the SMEs, they have greater difficulty for accessing credit, maybe because they don't have the financial information very clearly to analyze the credit, if they have the right to receive credit that many banks require. So the idea is to grant them greater access to credit to these SMEs. So we would like to understand how these programs work abroad, and we want to learn with the experience that these other countries have so that we can improve everything and also have more efficiency and effectiveness in our programs so that these loans can truly reach these SMEs. So as Mr. Monteiro from the ministry has mentioned, what our programs are. So we had the PRONAMP, which is the National Program of Access to Credit for SMEs, and so up until 4.8 million reais in revenues. And then we had the other program that expanded to the medium-sized companies up until 300 million reais. And we also had the SMEs that are managed by SEBRAE, and they have been working with this, with the collaterals to guarantee the credit, and they offered a lot of credit during the pandemic. So PRONAMP has become an official credit granting program carried out by the government, and we want to know its best practices, how we can improve it, and we want to ensure that it is sustainable in the long run so that we can continue granting credit to SMEs. So now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. José Fernando Figueiredo. He is the Honorary President of the European Association of Credit Granting Institutions and Collateral, so that we can learn. Mr. José Fernando Figueiredo, thank you for your participation. Hello, good morning in Brazil, good afternoon in Portugal. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me well? I'm trying to share my presentation. I'm trying to share my presentation. Can you see my screen? Yes, sir, we can. So I would like, first of all, to thank the invitation that was made for us to the Institution of Credit Guarantees and Collaterals. And so I would like to thank the Special Secretary, the Minister André Luiz Carvalho, and also Rafael Encinas, because he's going to be the moderator, the organizers, the technical team that is sponsoring and supporting this event. It's a great honor to be here representing the European Association. My name is José Fernando Figueiredo. I'm the Honorary President of this European Association of the Collateral and Guarantee Institutions. And so we have had many contacts with the Executive President, and today I'm only the Honorary President, okay? And so we try to guarantee credit I have worked a lot in this sector, and I can share with you that the European Association of Guarantees has been reflecting a lot about the topic of your webinar. I was born in Portugal, and so maybe I should change to my Portuguese with an accent from the state of Rio de Janeiro. We can understand you. You don't need to speak like a guy from Rio de Janeiro. And so this topic is very important because we in the European Association, we have been reflecting about this for a long time. And the topic of this webinar and this event, and I would like to congratulate it for organizing it, it's very important that was mentioned by the minister during the opening ceremony without missing out in anything that is the guarantee possibilities. And so in the first slide, I'm also the coordinator of the World Network of Collateral Institutions or Guarantee Institutions, the GNGI, that was created a few years ago. Institution that also has a Brazilian member, and we have members from all of the continents. We have people from the World Bank, from the European Commission, and we are discussing this topic that the minister mentioned. So the guarantee institutions have a very, very important role, as you have just mentioned, and the secretary also mentioned, as an instrument that is going to help the SMEs to have access to credit. And talking about SMEs that have a feasible project, that has economic feasibility, and issues that have to do with dimensions, symmetry, connections to the market, and also the allocation of the funds by the financial market. Sometimes they don't access credit in enough quantity or with sufficient conditions so that they can develop their projects. And so this is the failure in the financial market. And this is the role of the guarantee institutions, because they're going to grant a collateral, a guarantee. And so we can guarantee the totality of the capital of all of the credit. And we guarantee a substantial amount of this credit. And this guarantee allows the banks to have a great view of the credit that they're going to grant to that company, to that SME, and so that they can create a credit that otherwise they would not grant to a company. So this important role of the guarantee institutions also has a public support, a support from money collected from our taxpayers. And so this is part of the capital that the guarantee institutions have, okay? And so we have this public support. And we also have a second aspect that in Europe is very common, that the contra guarantee institutions that on their hand, they counter guarantee the operations that make the guarantee institutes, they become mutualistic, and they are managed by the private sector, by the business people themselves, and so the board of the directors is also part of this, a small part of the state, but they have a public support, as we all know. And this public support that has to do with an allocation of capital is usually a support that naturally has to be accessed, verified after the fact. And in the last few years, even before the crisis, and this is what I mentioned about the minister's presentation, before the crisis, when the guarantee systems, they were more developed, the percentage of guarantees based on the GDP was higher. There was already a movement that here in Portugal, I was also one of the founders of the guarantee systems in Portugal. And for over 10 years, we have already carried out the impact assessment of the capital that the Portuguese state invests in the counter guarantee fund. And this is a good practice. This started in Germany, then it went to other countries such as France that has highly developed systems, also South Korea, many Asian countries, in Canada, and we do exactly this. Why? Because it's essential for us in the end of everything to assess if that was the fundamental objective, this kind of measure, economic measure that is facilitating access to credit, carry out capacity building of the company so that they can carry out their projects, so that they can have a positive balance, resources for everything that is the dynamic of the country. And so if the state has a counter guarantee fund of 100 million, for instance, we have to expect the result. And so this is going to allow that the guarantee funds, they are going to invest millions and millions in credit into the economy, into the companies, and these millions and millions, they are going to overcome everything that was given by the state because of the taxes collected in terms of salaries, in terms of social security. And so macroeconomic volume that is way higher than the investment of public funds. So not always getting one of the mentioning something that you said, not always the sustainability is directly measured by what we call, what are the guarantee systems so that they can self-manage themselves, so that they can pay their overhead costs, and adding to the accounting results, adding this to their balance, company balances, and also the macroeconomic impact that is the existence of these mechanisms they generate in the economy. And in Portugal, I know this our market very well. These impacts are analyzed by independent bodies, independent agencies, by universities that are totally autonomous from the guarantee system and sector, and they have proven clearly that the contribution for the economy, the contribution for the products generated by these companies is extremely positive. Even the generation of employment growth. And very briefly, and so let me share. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me well? Yes, sir. We can. Can you please enlarge your slides? Can you please put it on presentation mode? Can you see it now? Ah, yes, now we can see it. Okay, thank you so much for your tip. Please call me José Fernando. You don't need to call me Mr. Figueiredo. So as I was saying, so let me start very briefly. So how much time do I have? Because I have forgotten how much time I have. About 20 more minutes, sir. And so are we going to have Q&As, a Q&A session, or via the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask me questions during the presentation, no problem, if this is in accordance with the protocol department. And so the European Association of Guarantee Institutions, credit institutions, as you can see, we are practically in all of the countries in Europe, in Eurasia, and we also have a high number of members that have their own guarantee systems, Portugal, Russia, and so only in the north of Europe we are not present, but we are undergoing negotiations now. But we have a strong representation in Europe, yes, with these guarantee systems. Just to show you the statistics, our associates, they have guarantees, a volume of guarantees. I'm sorry, I apologize, the translation is not very good because it was done in Brussels. So I'm going to have to correct some of the translation, but the volume of guarantees, of the portfolio of guarantees of the societies that are part of the European Association at the end of last year was about 330 billion euros, okay? It's about 2 trillion reais. We're talking about 48 members in 31 European countries, representing about 5.2 million SMEs. And so the credit granted the credit granted is about twice the amount of guarantees granted. And so we can have a lobby, we can carry out a lobby, we can have high influence, okay, in the European Union. That is going to be very important. Only last year, these numbers are also they are totally transparent by the special measures that were taken to combat the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis to try to help these companies. And so this is the normal portfolio that we have. And I believe now it's around 140 billion euros. A little bit over half, okay? And this is a direct result of the crisis. And even before the crisis, the members of the association, of the European Association, they already have a high volume of resources that support the financing of the European countries. And this gives you an idea of how the developed countries, they are allocating these guarantee resources. And so the more developed economies with a higher per capita GDP, and they receive a lot of support, and they have a higher penetration in terms of economic values and resources, okay? I'm trying to go on to the next slide, just a minute, I apologize. Okay, here, I got it now. And so regarding the measures to help during the COVID pandemic, of course, with the starting of the COVID crisis, the members of the European Association and the governments, they reacted very, very quickly. And even in Portugal, for instance, I continue being the president of the Portuguese Association of Guarantee Institutions, okay? We took quick measures. We implemented quick measures with the support of the government, and within 1 month, and in Brazil as well, and all over the world, we launched a set of credit lines with the support with the guarantee institutions, so that quickly we could make the financial resources arrive at the SMEs, because many people know that the commerce had to be closed, and many of the sectors, they were totally closed. And the rationale behind all of this, as was already mentioned by some of the previous presenters, discussed that the fact that we needed to make the credit arrive at the companies and to help the companies with their liquidity. Why? For a simple reason, because with the lockdown, we had a problem that the companies, they would have to close up. They could not remain open. They had to close their doors because this was a public and sanitary measure. But the assets of these companies, their productive capacity, their wealth, their employees, we could not keep them closed. So one of the first movements was to launch liquidity to the companies so that they could pay the salaries, they could pay their bills, and they could remain with their productivity active, even if their doors were closed. And so this sanitary emergency, and so their assets were protected, the people were there, and so that they could reactivate their business quickly. The alternative was to close their assets, close the companies, and start all over again with all of the costs that this would entail, and the inertia that they had to break up. And so this the guarantee institutions, and they proved this in Europe and and around the world. And this international network, a phenomenon that went from Japan to the USA to Argentina to Brazil to Lithuania, everybody used these guarantee institutions, public or private, so that they could launch these measures quickly, because alternatives to this would be alternatives of public subsidies, and from the consumption of resources perspective, this would be the worst option. And so a guarantee can benefit, and it could leverage the banking credit, and the state in the end would basically only pay for the losses or part of the losses, and not have to allocate directly all of the financial resources that were subsidized by the state directly.
Therefore, so this use during the crisis as an anti-cyclical aspect was fundamental. And once more, I've been through various crises, that once more it was proved, once more without doubt, that these guarantee systems as instruments, as a strong anti-cyclical instrument, this was all over the world, especially in the so-called Western world, where the financial capability allowed for other systems, but these systems were used. And one of the things that was very important to verify, that as regards the capability of adaptation of these institutions in the necessary speed and mechanisms, and it was interesting to, in one or another with smaller capability, these institutions knew very well how to use their procedures very quickly to create virtual credit mechanisms to avoid concentration. And this, once more, this was very important. And those that know the rules of the European Union, there are a lot of restrictions. The rules of competition, which each state cannot do alone, their own measures. Of course, the greater state have some facilities, ease, but there are some rules that imply in many restrictions, and the European Union opened these competition rules, and so that the countries could develop these measures. And they created specific programs for the COVID-19, increased in average the capacity of these guaranteeing institutions to do guarantees. These credit agencies are regulated by the state. Then you have the mutual guarantee assistance societies, like in Brazil as well. And these societies benefited from an increase of this availability of capability because they had a greater public capability, leveraging them with their private credits they have. The maximum increase of guarantees was increased by beneficiary, so that companies already had some leverage could have more. They increased the area of coverage on capital on loans. Like I mentioned, we reduced a lot of the bureaucratic requisites. We accelerated many processes. Clearly, an enormous effort was done for us to be quicker in guarantees, in delivering guarantees. A lot of reimbursement was made flexible, and many reduced or even leverage away the taxes and interest rates, and many companies weren't generating any cash flow and couldn't pay them. And something that is also very relevant, the idea of the requisites or personal collateral or personal guarantees in terms of the risk of the credit was reduced significantly, sometimes even let go or dispense. So this was guaranteed various new sectors in the social sector and those that follow up on the elderly, those who deal with education, and we increased a lot of the members of our counseling services, tutoring, helping in fulfilling the prerequisites so that they could advance. Here we have, as you can see, an information on the volume of the guarantee, especially in the pandemic. This went through all of Europe, or also at the world level, Asia. Asia is already the continent with greatest guarantees, one of the greatest providers of portfolio of guarantees, and also increase. As you can see, the number of SMEs increased in a significant way as well. I would say, trying to summarize what I said in the beginning, of this movement in the result of the pandemic, there is a set of principles and reflections that I would like to transmit to you. The first, of course, is that the effect, the positive effect of these credit guarantee societies as mechanisms of development and giving support to the economy and enterprises. These societies are very close to the market. They have this capability in terms of reducing the losses if in case of default by the client, and this naturally helps the bank to do the credit in another way. But this proximity, of course, it diversifies and increases, has this anti-cyclical effect that I mentioned. And there are some questions that are important as good practices, as we are discussing these best practices. To assure exactly these good practices and to keep norms of quality that are important. Firstly, the idea of the partnership. In very few cases and circumstances, does it make sense that the banking institute have 100% coverage of its credit? The bank or location company should have always some risk. We in the European is the minimum risk they should cover, except in an emergency. But in a normal situation, the bank has to have at least 20% of risk that they won't have a moral hazard in what are their credit decisions. Another principle which we consider fundamental is that the guarantee society should be integrated in a logic of partnership. They should have regulation, control on the quality of their teams. This implies naturally, in terms of these guarantees, a strict analysis, a mechanism of commissioning, of adequate. It should never be for free, of course, in terms that part of those that receive, that we are talking about scarce resources that have to be remunerated, even though in a crisis situation, in a quick manner, could be without any remuneration, but obviously there should be a good capability of a balance, analysis of the equilibrium. Also, those credit portfolios should have a follow-up. There should be established a panel for control that has sustainability indicators of these systems, and the government support should be subsidized with the counter guarantees, of course, with some limitation. It cannot be 100% of those credits, except in very exceptional circumstances. And in the presentation, something I'd like to highlight, we have a thought which has to do with the establishment of norms of quality that can be sustainable in the future as regards a mixture of the operational result or the counter guarantee and its economic macro impact. And this should be considered in this analysis. Of course, there's a context of regulatory framework. There has to be a deep knowledge of the market, and it has to imply in a clear focus of the various components, the type of capital, of what the development plans, business plans, those that are the statutes of the internal regulatory statutes, and the governance, and naturally those internal documents and adequate analysis of it. I wouldn't say conservative, but prudent and adequate to the risks and to those companies that deserve. As regards impact studies, we do a lot of impact studies, and these studies permitted, firstly, to notice that there are some areas that growing, like in the AECM, where all of the members are doing these impact studies. It was only 37% the pandemic, and in the post-pandemic, most will do. In Latin America, it's way less. Then you have the quality of the impact studies and what are the results. A fundamental issue is the issue of the additionality, where the guaranteeing institution has to increase capability or financial capability, and the studies prove that. We have here various examples of the development bank and the BPI France, the Development Bank of France, where by norm these studies prove, like what I mentioned before, the positive impact of these guaranteeing institutes, but what is the increase of financing that these societies can give. I don't know if it was clear, if you heard me up to the end, but with this I'd like to end. Thank you for your attention. Of course, I can answer any questions you might put. Thank you, Mr. José Fernando. It was very clear. It was very productive. We will do the questions at the end of the 3 presentations. We're going to get our questions for the YouTube. So if you do allow me, Rafael, 30 seconds, just a last note. We have responsible for policies in Brazil listening to us. I just need to leave a little reminder note to those responsible. and what I said to the European Commission response. After everything was said, we shouldn't forget that these guarantee mechanisms, of credit guarantee mechanisms, already are very positive, allow access when they allow for normal times. Now that where you have a new phase of economic recovery in some countries, or the maintenance of growth, or change of the economic profile or productive profile of the country, those responsible should remember that these credit guarantee societies are very useful in this, let's so-called normal phase of growth, to another type of operations which are not only crisis-oriented. We're here to finance development, growth, dynamization, modernization of enterprises, acquisition, and growth to greater dimensions, to innovate, economic innovation. So it's important that these mechanisms continue, and I'd like to hear of some the policies that the Brazilian government said should continue and adapt to another phase of the economic cycle. But it's important to have this guarantee system, and Brazil has done a great advance. I know very well the experiences in the South, and I've spoken much in conferences, and you have various mechanisms in such a big country that is so important to the world like Brazil that should be made more dynamic. And as a Portuguese speaker as well, I would be very happy to see that in Brazil, we will continue with the support of government authorities. Thank you very much. I would like you to share the screen. So, continuing our event, I will now going to call Stefan Reyes, which is the representative of the OECD, and he's going to talk a little bit about the work they did, not only in support to credit, and that had a very significant, important work.
For sharing your experiences during this support for small and medium companies. Thank you very much, and you can speak.
Thank you very much, Rafael, and good morning, Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear colleagues. It's a great pleasure for me to share our work at the OECD in Paris. In the OECD, we started monitoring the impact of COVID at a very early stage in a large number of domains, which you can find on our website, where we have policy analysis, I think, of over 200 different areas, trying to understand what happened there. And for sure, the measures regarding SMEs and entrepreneurship were the ones that we started monitoring first and very extensively. And I had the pleasure of leading that work, and I'm glad to show you a bit of the results of that. I share my screen. Hopefully that will work. I'll share, let me see. Voila, voila. I believe, Rafael, that you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Now, what we did over the course of the last year is monitor the impact of the pandemic on small businesses, as well as the policies that were developed. We looked at policies a bit broader than only guarantee instruments, but I hope that that's still of relevance for the discussion today. Over 1 year into the pandemic, we tried to take stock of what happened and make a paper where we formulated lessons learned out of this policy response to the pandemic. That's not an evaluation as such, but hopefully it generates relevant insights also for Brazil, who we included in the study as well, in further improving the already impressive policy response in Brazil. What I'll do, and I'll move to the next slide, I'll briefly speak on the impact of the pandemic on SMEs and entrepreneurs, and then try to give a brief description of the development of policies, including, of course, the credit guarantees, and then reflect a little bit on these 15 lessons learned that we identified, not all of them in detail, obviously, but to give you an idea of what we think are important lessons, hopefully also for the Brazilian experience. Let me start by the impact of the pandemic on SMEs. You see in the right-hand panel of this slide how more than the 2008 crisis, more than many other crises, the COVID-19 pandemic really took SMEs and entrepreneurs at the center. They were at the center of what was happening there. The slide shows the share of SMEs in employment in the most affected sectors. And what you see is that in many countries across the OECD, that share even amounted to over 70 and 80% of the jobs that were affected. They were indeed in the smaller businesses. So more than ever, I think that this crisis hit SMEs. And what we did in our work, we monitored over 180 surveys across 30 countries or more, and we consistently found in these surveys that 70 to 80% of SMEs reported that they experienced a strong drop in revenue, often of ranging between 30 and 50%. 40% of SMEs across countries even stopped operating temporarily or even permanently. Even at this moment of the crisis in the United States, there is still over 35% of SMEs being out of business compared to January 2020. We are not out of the crisis yet. And as you can imagine, this also had a big impact on the confidence of business owners. But what was remarkable is that over the course of the pandemic, of course, a large number of SMEs temporarily closed their business, but that the picture for insolvencies and bankruptcies was rather different. There is a significant number of countries where over 2020, up until the first quarter of 2021, bankruptcies were actually much lower than in previous years. That reflects the support being given by governments, including the guarantee schemes that were just discussed also by my AECM colleague, as well as that governments in many countries changed temporarily insolvency laws, trying to avoid that SMEs that in principle were still viable were not being put out of business because of the liquidity shortage that they face. But looking forward, and predictions vary a bit, there is still reason for concern in a number of countries. And you see that in the right-hand panel. Spain, for instance, expectations are for bankruptcies to significantly rise, whereas in a number of other countries, the expectations are that this decline will continue for a while. So the development in bankruptcies rates. Next to that, of course, it is interesting to see what the pandemic did on new businesses, on startup rates. And there, I think that it's pretty clear that in the first phase of the pandemic, startup rates took a big hit. And you can imagine that new entrepreneurs in a situation where there's so much uncertainty, where there were so many closures, that's not the easiest moment to start your new business. But then again, over the course of the pandemic, and it depends a bit by country, over summer 2020, you saw that in a number of countries, actually, this rate of new business creation started to increase again. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, but also in a number of other countries there. Whereas in other countries, and you see in the bottom there, Russia, for instance, but also Portugal, that decline in startup rates continued quite a long time. This is a puzzling issue that we're looking at. I mean, in part, this new rise in startup rates could reflect what we call necessity-driven entrepreneurship, where people are no longer finding a job in the regular labor market and now start a business to compensate for that. But there's more to that. It might also be that in a number of countries, actually, COVID also triggered new entrepreneurship and offered new challenges for entrepreneurs to dive into, and that indeed there's also a good extent of opportunity-driven entrepreneurship that was created over the course of the pandemic. There's, of course, various more aspects of this impact of the pandemic on SMEs, but I want to go towards a discussion on policies because I think that is at the core of this very important conference you organized. A bit in line with the previous speakers, what we saw when we monitored 60 countries in their policy response is that actually the tools that they used were roughly similar. They related to employment, as was also the case in Brazil, of course, to try to avoid that workers were losing their jobs and that entrepreneurs were helped to keep them employed. Part of it revolved around deferrals, so ensuring that there was no money going out, that the taxes could be paid in a postponed way, but also that creditors, sometimes in the private sector, accepted to be paid later on. A very important part, of course, of what governments did related to loans and loan guarantees. That I think, I would think as well, stood at the heart of the efforts that were undertaken in the first half of 2020 and continue to this very day. But next to that, there was also grants. And I think that's important to underline, grants and subsidies. In fact, what we saw is that over the course of the pandemic, the use of grants significantly increased. And then finally, and that's of course where we look at the OECD a lot, there are also other policies in the policy mix, policies of a more structural nature to help SMEs become more resilient by supporting their digitalization, by supporting skills, by helping them to innovate as part of that policy response. Now, if you look at these policies over time, and I apologize because for different countries, the timing is of course not completely identical, but I hope you recognize the pattern nevertheless. You see on the left-hand side how when the pandemic hit, there was of course immediately these liquidity support schemes and guarantee schemes that were either inexistent, they were extended, they were made more accessible. The levels of guarantee up to 100% were increased in there. And over the course of the first half of 2020, you see that a little bit of optimism came back in a number of countries with discussions on gradually lifting lockdown measures and reassessing these support measures, which you see in the middle of the screen. But then in Europe and I think in a number of Asian countries as well, when second outbreak started to occur after the summer, you saw that there was a new expansion of liquidity support, which to some extent lasts until this very day, although in European countries, the United States, where vaccinations have processed and proceeded, that now there is an increasing use of grants and also equity measures in the policy mix, looking at how that can be restructured as part of what countries are doing. The structural support, which you see at the bottom arrow, initially started in a number of countries. A country like Ireland or Korea from the outset included help for digitalization as part of their emergency support. Very important to also help SMEs to respond. And you see, of course, over the course from June onwards that countries launched these recovery packages, which were much broader in nature and included a variety of infrastructure, but also demand measures depending a bit on the situation. What we see as well is that there was, despite this similar policy mix and a relatively comparable sequence, that there were differences in use. This graph shows the different use by country income level of a number of policy measures. And you see that there is quite strong emphasis on measures relating to labor, on deferrals, and you see also in the middle of the screen how loan guarantees stood as the most used instrument in countries, certainly in high income countries, but also in middle income countries. The structural measures at the bottom, that is where you see less use, which you can imagine, and is also lesser the case in lower income countries. Finally, and this is interesting, I think, also for the debate, there was, of course, a strong difference in intensity of the policy measures. That depends in part, of course, on the fiscal situation of countries, in part on the severity of the recession, but you see that from countries like Japan, although might be some overstatement I read in the Peterson report yesterday, but where the impulse was very high, as in Italy, whereas in countries like Mexico or Indonesia, this was less the case. What you also see is that there is quite a difference in the composition of how fiscal policy was organized, with a number of countries putting a strong emphasis on the loans equity and the guarantee, because that weighs in very strongly. I think you see in Italy that's strongly the case, for instance, but also in Germany, whereas other countries like the United States put the emphasis on more discretionary spending in response to the crisis. Let me now go, Rafael, if I have another couple of minutes, to say a few things about these lessons learned. Again, they are not evaluations, but hopefully they help also in the Brazilian discussion on what we see. This is the 15 lessons learned that are in our paper, and we'll make sure, of course, that it's further available. Part of these lessons relate to, let's say, the start of the crisis. There was, of course, in the beginning, this need to deliver as quickly as possible with the support programs to SMEs. Now, that, I think, triggered a very important renewal in let's say, digital delivery systems, but also in finding a balance between accountability and reaching the firms that need it. There were lessons, I think, on how to reach vulnerable segments on the SME population. I mean, women entrepreneurs were strongly affected, for instance. I mean, these are important lessons, but part of the lessons learned are also more forward-looking. They are more like, okay, where we stand now, and hopefully we'll move forward into recovery. What are the things that need to be taken into account? Now, 15 lessons learned sounds nice, but of course it's too many to present in a presentation. So I'll finish what I want to say with the 3 key ones that we think are important to take into account. And the first one relates to, also at this moment, let's make sure that we don't let the liquidity crisis that we narrowly escaped for SMEs in many cases still end in a solvency crisis, because the debt levels of SMEs have increased significantly. The second one is that when we design these recovery packages, these build back better packages, as some call them, with an emphasis on digital, perhaps on greening, on infrastructure, that we do not forget what small businesses need to recover. And finally, never waste a good crisis. It's been said many times, but there are also further lessons that we could learn. Briefly talk about these 3 lessons. The first one, avoid the solvency crisis. The IMF did a paper just 2 months ago trying to assess the increase in insolvency rates amongst SMEs, showing that on average worldwide, and what they look like at insolvency rates among small businesses now reach 16% of the small business population. And in some countries, in Europe, for instance, that percentage being significantly higher. Imagine, in Europe, there's 25 million SMEs. If the share there of insolvent SME would reach 20%, then we're talking about 5 million SMEs that still risk going bankrupt. That's massive. And in deciding on liquidity support and credit support, governments need to be very aware that withdrawing this too quickly might lead to quite dramatic rises in insolvencies in countries. Targeting better is an important lesson learned. At the beginning of the crisis, the aim was to bring money.
Interrompeu um pouco a conexão, acho.
We lost you for a while.
Stefan, está ouvindo a gente? Acho que ele deve ter caído um pouquinho.
Mr. Stefan, can you hear us?
And through loans in this crisis, but there's an increasing need to make sure that we use other support in this policy mix to avoid this looming debt crisis. My next slide is about the second lesson learned. In these recovery packages, in these build back packages, it is important to keep this SME focus. In the first half of the pandemic, before the summer of 2020, there was an enormous focus on SMEs. I don't think that there have ever been so many SME-oriented policy measures being designed as in that period. But with the recovery packages, you see the SME focus wither away, disappear a bit in front of your eyes. And we think it's very important that also in recovery, SMEs are consulted, the packages are tested on the impact for SMEs, and also that these packages.
Acredito que o Stefan caiu agora com a apresentação dele.
Já voltou.
Hi, Stefan.
I apologize. I don't know what happened, but I was reaching the end of my presentation. So I suggest, Raphael, if that's okay, that I conclude here. Yes. I showed you the lessons learned. Don't let the solvency crisis appear. Make sure that you include SMEs. The last thing that I wanted to add to that is that we've learned a lot over this pandemic. I don't know how that is the case in Brazil, but for instance, in the Netherlands, where I come from, in all the SME support that we had before the pandemic, we reached only 5% of SMEs. 5%. That was the population that we reached. Whereas with the pandemic, the share of small businesses that now have contacts with government has increased tremendously. These are also data to learn from. These are new relationships to build on. So we also hope that with that learning experience, that we're able to design policies for recovery that are even better than the ones that are already in place in Brazil and other countries. So I leave it to that, Rafael. Thank you so much for your attention. And I apologize, I wasn't able to speak in Portuguese. Next time, I'll do my best to do it like that. But
thank you very much, Stefan. It was very great. It was a very rich presentation. I think you don't need to speak Portuguese because your presentation was so rich for us, and the experience that you shared for us is very good in your lessons too. So I think we have a lot to learn from you. Thank you very much again. Agora eu gostaria de passar a palavra então
And
ao
so
Giovanni
now I would like to
Bevillaqua,
pass the
que
floor
é
to
analista do
Giovanni,
Sebrae.
okay? Giovanni Bevillaqua, he is an analyst at Sebrae, and he's
Das
going to share a
políticas e das
little bit of
garantias
the
de crédito
perspective of
aqui
these
no Brasil, como que a
policies,
gente pode
ensuring
aplicar.
credit in Brazil, and how we can apply. Welcome, Giovanni Bevillaqua. And so thank you, Rafael. Thank you, TCU, for the invitation. And I would like to greet all of you, especially Mr. José Fernando and Mr. Stefan Reyes, and I believe that they have facilitated my work a lot, my presentation a lot, with the lessons learned, the experience that they shared, everything that is happening in Europe, in the countries that are members of the OECD, because we are users of all of these researches and articles and papers that are produced by the OECD and by Europe, and we have followed them up, and we have tried to understand the policies that are carried out in other parts of the world, and we try to adjust them to the Brazilian reality and also to our conditions. So thank you so much for this opportunity. So my presentation is going to be divided mainly on showing to you how was the scenario for the SMEs in Brazil last year during the pandemic, and how the funding via credit, starting from the importance of the programs, the government programs that were implemented and launched. And at the end, I'm going to try to show to you what we are analyzing and foreseeing for the future of the PMEs in Brazil during the post-pandemic era. So just a minute, I'm going to share my slides, and due to the time, I'm going to speak about some things very quickly so that we can have room for debate and so that we can also have a Q&A session. Just a second, I'm going to share my slides. So can you see my screen? Can you see my screen? Okay, so initially, in the first context, Secretary Bruno mentioned at the beginning of the importance of the PMEs in Brazil. And so most of the businesses that we have here in Brazil, they are part of the small businesses. And small businesses in Brazil, they have a different classification. It's a very well-established classification. All the companies that have a revenue up to 4.8 million reais. And so we have micro businesses, small businesses, and the micro individual entrepreneurs. And only the micro entrepreneurs, we have millions and millions of small entrepreneurs. So this set of companies and businesses and all of this totality of the enterprises that we have in Brazil, they are responsible for about 30% of the Brazilian GDP. And they represent 99% of all the companies. And so the opportunities that I have, and this topic is very important. And so this kind of seminar, I always say that the Brazilian economy is an economy of SMEs. So the importance that they have for the economy from the perspective of the production of products and services, and also the social aspects when it comes to the generation of jobs, and also the insertion of these companies. And this is very important. So any point that is going to help them improve their competitiveness and production is going to have a huge impact over the Brazilian economy as a whole.
During the pandemic, from the beginning, we from the SEBRAE, together with the FGV, the Foundation of Getúlio Vargas, we've been monitoring the development and its impact on small business. We've already launched 10 editions on the small business. And in a general way, the design from last year, so the impact on the small business during the pandemic was very strong. This all over the country. The companies working during the pandemic, many had to modify the way they were acting or working, and a lot due to the measures necessary to contain the pandemic. So this demand from Brazilian entrepreneurs a great change, even in their business plans and how they work. What called our attention, especially in April, there was a very strong drop in the income of these companies as compared to before the pandemic. So in average, 79% dropped. Some sectors, some business segments were more affected. Basically, all the segments with where you have consumption, where you have to be live or present, were the most affected. And this impacted strongly in their income, especially tourism, creative economy, beauties, food services, and artisans and handicraft. Basically, all of the segments of the economy were affected, some more, some less. But the average was the income drop was 40% compared to before the pandemic. In this survey, there was an advantage because we interviewed directly the entrepreneurs. So 57% already at the end of the year in all regions said that they had great difficulties in keeping their business going. Around 24% saw that the pandemic period was a moment of opportunities that brought changes that were valuable to their business, especially what we call digital transformation of companies. A good part of the companies started to use digital means for sales, using social networks, apps, the internet in general, in terms of to try to keep their activities during the pandemic. So in the total of Brazil, around 69% of the companies accelerated this digital transformation. This is something that was already being tried, but during the pandemic, this was accelerated. And here we go more into the main theme, which is of our seminar, which is the financing. Good part of the companies, around 70% of them, had debts, loans that are on time or a little bit delayed, 34% with some delay. So the indebtedness of the companies is a reason of concern, and I'm going to talk about that at the end. And since the beginning of the crisis, 51% of small businesses sought some kind of bank loan. This is data. We could ask, why wasn't there more? Why only half? Small businesses in Brazil traditionally are not financed by the finance system, that they seek some kind of financing in the credit market. Since 2013, we do yearly this financing of small businesses, and what we observed that good part of that financing migrated of certain types of financing that were non-banking to this modality, especially this last year in 2020. Until 2019, 47% of them were financed with their suppliers. They would pay in longer terms. 50% used credit cards as financing. And we know they have very high interest rates. So what we saw last year, and that's one of the importance of these programs, this reduced a lot. So last year, the payment of long-term payment of suppliers was reduced, and financing through credit cards is still high, but you can see a reduction. So what happened? That there was a migration from financing with financing with financial institutions. So what were the difficulties to obtain credit? Were kept. This is not a strange phenomenon. We knew that only a part of the companies, SMEs, use the finance system for many reasons. Very high interest rates, or maybe the difficulties in access in terms of providing information that the financial institutions demand, this increases the difficulty. During the crisis, we still had 53% of business that sought credit and were not able to get it. So in our opinion, it's still necessary measures to give support to these small businesses. And this comes from their own opinion. In the survey, that for Brazil as a whole, but you can see it in all regions, the set of answers of the need to extend credit lines with special terms, especially like in Pronamp, and the extension of the emergency aid. These are measures that are seen as relevant. Why is the emergency help important? Because basically these resources, these were spent in small businesses. Those beneficiaries of the emergency aid was consumed in these small businesses. Therefore, that's why there's a relative importance that these entrepreneurs gave to that measures. So extension of credit lines, special conditions, and the emergency aid to the population. And this is the panorama of credit concessions. Last year, there was an increase of credit concession in 28%, but around 20%, sorry. And for small businesses, 28%, as compared to 2019. So 1.6 trillion reais were given to companies over the years, sorry. So notice, this is an important phenomena. The last big crisis that Brazil went through around 2015-17, there was a reduction in credit concession in around 20%. So for small businesses, that was a 30% drop. So do notice that in this period, during the pandemic, with a huge uncertainty, especially in the restriction for these companies, you expected that the financing through credit would have this big reduction. And this credit wasn't reduced. This happened for two reasons. Due to the great availability of liquidity through the financial system that was given to the financial system at the beginning of the crisis by the central bank, by the monetary authorities. So this great cushion of liquidity was given to the system. And in a second moment, through the advent of these programs in support of credit, were configured as guarantee programs. And what called our attention, even with this increase of credit concessions to companies that happened in 2020, for almost 30% for these SMEs, the proportion of credit conceded to companies stayed more or less stable, 20%, 21% at some moment. It was 20% in 2018, 21%. So what we saw last year, that the credit concession happened to all the sizes, all company sizes, but the proportion to the SMEs was kept stable. Since 2012, it's been around 20% of credits that are given to companies is absorbed by these small businesses. And this is where it is important. Do notice, like I mentioned before, between 2015 and 2017, we verified a reduction in the level of concession of credits to small businesses. And since 2017, this credit has been increasing until at the end of the year, you verified a reduction in this concession. So in the first trimester of 2021, as regards the last trimester of 2020, we could observe a drop of around 14% for these SMEs. So notice this is important, and this I will echo what Stefan mentioned, and also José Fernando, that the programs that were present last year, all of them stopped working. So there is this drop of credit concession, and in my evaluation, partly due to the opportunity that these programs gave, which shows the relevance of these programs. Because last year, my analysis was that they allowed that the credit market continue to work for small companies, for small enterprises, as well as the liquidity I mentioned, so that the credit market didn't have a stronger drop like what happened between 2015 and 2017. What we verified that for small businesses, there was a reduction in the interest rate. In the beginning of 2020, the average interest rate for small businesses was around 40% per year. And over the last year, there was a reduction in interest rate. This might need a more technical explanation. This is an average that is calculated through concession. So in the various modalities of credit, and with the emergency programs, focus especially in credit lines for cash flow credit with lower credit, this reduced the average interest rate. At the end of the year, we saw that a small increase of the interest rates between the third and fourth trimester, especially for micro companies. And the average rate in general, at least in the first trimester in 2021, the average interest rate has been around 27% per annum. And at the same time, we verified a significant drop, and we were already observing this in default rates in bank loans. The greatest drop as regards the individual micro entrepreneurs, which in the beginning of in 2016 were around 20% default, and the last data shows around 7%. As regards default, there is a phenomena here that should be observed. That great part of the program, especially the Pronamp, which is the biggest that was launched last year, set a period of time in terms of taking on credit and repay them. But not only that, but also aligned, there is a better concession that these default rates dropped despite having been kept at lower levels than that we've had in our history. So the concession of credit in Brazil for small companies is basically bank And we have multiple banks, commercial banks, federal banks. So 80% of the credit supply comes from this, multiple banks, commercial banks, or federal banks. But what we verified last year, and this is what is important, that there are an increase of new institutions that are offering credit, especially foment agencies, credit cooperatives. Credit cooperativism has been increasing in participation for small businesses already for many years, and very interesting interest rates. Since 2019 and to 2020, the concession by credit cooperatives increased almost 25%. Why is this relevant? Another relevant phenomena was the arrival of new entries like these direct credit societies that started to be regulated and authorized by the central bank from 2018 onwards. In 2020, you had a great increase of credit societies that were allowed directly by the central bank to start working. So this proliferation of new entries in the market is very important for the small businesses because it diversifies the quantity of those who are offering credit. Some additional characteristics, which I will mention. The quantity of those that took some credit, banks, cooperatives, direct banks, etc., they've been growing since 2015. But this is something that called our attention, that in the period of the crisis, this quantity of those who took credit remained stable. This shows the credit market in Brazil, but it's been documented in other parts of the world that the history of operation of credit within the financial system is a relevant factor. Credit is conceded to those companies that have a credit history. Financial institutions work like a great processors of information. They try to reduce the asymmetry of information from those who take credit and those institutions.
So the more knowledge we have about these people who get loans, who get credit, easier it becomes for them to have access to credit. So as I mentioned before, so conceding credit to SMEs is recognized as being very restricted. So since 2012, which is the data that we have available, we have this historical set of data here. About 20% of all of the credit granting goes to SMEs. And this didn't even change during the pandemic. However, the analysis that I carried out is that the programs that were launched, support to credit in 2020, mainly the two main ones of guarantees, PEAC using guarantees from the FGI, and PRONAMP, after the operation was made possible by the FGO, and also with the support of SEBRAE, they allow the credit sector to work, the credit market to work, and so that the companies could have access to the credit so that they could carry out their activities. Regarding the FAMP, which is the Guarantee Fund for SMEs, FAMP, between March and up until the 30th of April of this year, this year, from last year to this year, gave credit to about 5.2 billion SMEs all over Brazil. And so this was a very important measure. Why? Mainly because at the end of the year, the programs that were in the package to combat the pandemic, they were suspended. They stopped, and now they're coming back. So FAMP has a very important role by allowing access to credit, because they are giving guarantees and collaterals to SMEs. And from SEBRAE's perspective, this is aligned with what we call assisted credit. There is a program created by SEBRAE that follows up those that got loans, and they follow them up throughout the entire phases, all the phases. And so the guarantees of the credit, they are important. Mr. José Fernando and Mr. Stefan, they mentioned this. Having guarantees, having collaterals to receive credit is a great mitigator of all risks. And another great mitigator of risks is knowledge that the entrepreneurs have, the assistance that they can count on. And so FAMPE, the FAMPE, and all of the resources and all of the companies that got credit from the financial market using guarantees from FAMPE, all of them, they were followed up, they were aided, they were assisted by SEBRAE throughout the entire process. And this had a tendency, and also not only a tendency, but ensured greater access to these companies to the funding, okay? And so why is this important? Why? Because the small companies in Brazil, the small and medium-sized companies in Brazil, and this is a piece of data from our last research regarding the survival of enterprises and companies. And it shows a study that was carried out by our strategic planning unit, coordinated by my friend Marco, and they were trying to update this research regarding the survival of companies. And this new version of the research counted on a study, an econometric that had an econometric model regarding the survival of companies, and also research with the business people themselves. And so it shared with us relevant data that micro entrepreneurs, micro individual entrepreneurs, they have a bankruptcy rate that is very, very high. 29% of them close after 5 years of activities. Micro companies, about 21.6%. And the small companies, their mortality rate is around 17% after 5 years of activities. In the specific cases of the companies that closed their doors in 2020 for good, and these data are very important, is that a higher percentage of these people, most of them, they were unemployed before opening their business. So they had low levels of knowledge, low level of knowledge of their business, okay? And so they opened up businesses because they needed to, because they were unemployed. And these are the most important data of the research. They had no knowledge. They had little access to credit. These compos also had lower levels of initiative. And so they didn't carry out capacity building efforts. So half of these companies, they closed for good in 2020. And what was the determining factor was the beginning of the pandemic. And so this research is available on our website, and you should check it out. And something else that is very important for our debate, what kind of aid would be useful to avoid the closing up or the bankruptcy of these companies? So facilitated credit, more clients, less taxes, And so this chart shows how important it is for these companies to have access to credit via credit or other ways that I'm going to mention soon. And starting from here, we also have the permanence of the support programs. So some points for our discussion and also to move forward. The debts that these companies and families have acquired is very important. It's an important point, and we must deal with this now. And even to allow us to have a better future, a more sustainable future, and also a more sustainable economy after the pandemic. Okay, approval of the permanent PRONAMP, and this is very relevant, and mainly now because PRONAMP now has a new program, the permanent program, and it has a configuration of a guarantee fund, a guarantee fund. So these two measures are very, very important, helping the families and the companies that are in debt, and also the permanent, the approval of the permanent PRONAMP, so that we can allow the sustainability of the economy and also that they can grant more and more credit to the SMEs. Another point that I also like to emphasize is the advance of non-banking financial institutions, so that SMEs can have access to credit, like the credit cooperatives, like the fostering institutions, societies for direct credit, and many fintechs that are appearing now in the Brazilian market. And all of them have very important characteristics, and they work jointly with the SMEs, not only giving them credit, okay, increasing the number of companies that offer credit, but they follow up these SMEs really closely in a configuration of what all the literature mentions, that this is a funding filled with opportunities. And so the cooperatives, the credit societies, the fintechs, they know SMEs well. They know the SMEs well. And so they know them beyond their accounting balances. They know their businesses. They know the entrepreneurs well. Giovanni, I apologize. And so you should wrap up, please, so that we can have a debate. Okay, I'm wrapping up. And so these points are relevant. And also regarding the digital transformation, the capacity building of the entrepreneurs, this is going to need to be intensified. And all of the digital transformation, it needs funding. And so the funding for innovations and for investment, and also investments, the funding of SMEs, most of it is via the credit market, but we have other ways. And also innovative companies, they need this. They need investments. They need the injection of funds like they do it in Europe, and also credit as an investment. And another important point that should be followed is the complementary law, or the Bill of Law number 33, okay? That is going to create the legal framework for re-entrepreneurship. And this is going to help the small and medium-sized companies to overcome the pandemic, and also for them to be able to reinvent their businesses. And so by wrapping up, I would like to invite all of you to access for you to access our Data Sebrae. And Data Sebrae is the greatest data repository that we have in Brazil about SMEs. All of our studies, all of our researches, all of our data, everything is available at Data Sebrae. We also have the Data Sebrae COVID. And we have all of the studies, analysis, guidelines for SMEs during the pandemic period, and also the impact assessment. And so please feel free to access this. And thank you for the opportunity. Thank you so much, Giovanni. And so the three presentations, they were very, very good, very fruitful. They shared a lot of knowledge for us, and for us to absorb this is going to be very difficult. So now I would like to start with the questions. Minister André, do you have any question for the speakers, or do you have final comments? Thank you, Rafael. I would like to congratulate all of the speakers because they approached the topic very well, and I have a question as a citizen. And maybe this question could be directed to Giovanni, but if the other speakers would like to participate, this would be interesting. So as a citizen, I have been seeing in Brazil the time horizon of the credit line seemed to me to be very short, very short. I don't know if this is true, but I saw on TV the other day some indicators that when there was the PRONAMP in the first phase, when it was the day to pay the loan, the companies didn't have the funds to pay the credit they had borrowed, the loans they had gotten. And so the credit line is to be paid in a short period of time. So the economic crisis generated by the pandemic was something unexpected and never before seen. So in a short period of time, the companies, the SMEs, they had a huge economic impact, a terrible economic impact. And then you open up a credit line and you say, look, you're going to receive this credit, and in 6 months, 1 year, you're going to pay me back. But the impact, the economic impact was so great regarding the assets and other economic aspects of the company, and that it seems to me that the guarantee fund and even the systematic to support this, they should have granted credit in a longer period of time with a longer deadline. And as a citizen, okay, so I'm not a technician. And so also you have an account connected to the FGTS, and then the worker can manage that fund throughout time. Maybe there should be something like that along these credit lines for the SMEs. And to wrap up, the same thing happened, if I'm not mistaken. I believe Bruno is not present here because he was the first speaker, but the same thing happened, if I'm not mistaken, with the tax moratorium. Credit moratorium. And so during a certain period of time, the companies would suspend the payment of taxes for some time. But then 3 or 4 months later, they would have to pay the taxes that they owed at that time and the previous taxes. And as a citizen, is that they dealt the pandemic and the payment of this credit line and also the taxes. And it was something that happened in a short period of time. And maybe they should have received a longer credit line. It took a long time for me to ask the question, Rafael, but just to give you the context. Giovanni and the other friends, what do you understand regarding this? So yes, Minister, you are right when it comes to this. So the impact was huge, as I mentioned, and José Fernando and Stefan mentioned. The impact was huge. Just to give you an idea of the size of what this pandemic represented in our history, if I'm not mistaken, another drop of the economic activities happened during, only something similar to this happened in the 1930s. So the only similar period that we had was in the 1930s. And so the pandemic caused the same impact in only a few months. And I agree with you when you say that this was novel, this was unprecedented. However, and I believe that this explains a little bit the design of the policies, is this nature of unprecedented moment. How can you design a policy How can you design a policy for something that you had never seen before? And so this is a huge problem of the design of the policy. How should I design this? How can I establish policies to allow the economy to maintain its level of activities, or at least to fight against the pandemic? And what has become very clear, SMEs in Brazil that were impacted by the pandemic, and unfortunately, those that simply shut down, it was not because they offered bad products or bad services. The pandemic impacted everybody, all the companies. So it was a holistic pandemic, and it was brutal to many companies. And so the support policies and the support mechanisms, they had to be configured and designed within this context of unprecedented times. We had never seen anything like this before. And so we had no recipes from the past that we could reuse. And so I believe, lessons were learned, and they deserve to be learned when it comes to combating or fighting against such a crisis. And your question was simple, but the answer is very complex. So how can we protect our economy if the economy simply stops? What should we do? So I believe that many lessons were learned, even as regards the design of policies. And an example of this that is very relevant is the implementation of the permanent PRONAMP, okay, that is now a guarantee fund, and so it has sustainability characteristics, permanent characteristics, and an example that I envied José Fernando when you mentioned that in Europe that the guarantee system has that 10 million euros in the guarantee funds, José Fernando. I don't even know how to count 10 million euros, yes? And so analyzing this shows the importance of these institutional designs, even these guarantee funds.
Because if we had these guarantee funds that are robust and operating, the financial institutions will operate. So lessons were learned, some in a very hard manner, and our hope is that our work now is to learn with the problems and try to design public policies, be public government actions, but also private actions, so that we can think in the development of our economy in a more robust and sustainable way. Thank you, Giovanni. I would like to hear José Fernando, Stefan, because we had this break, 31st of December, due to budgeting things. Our programs were closed. Now in June, that we started some of them again. And Stefan mentioned you couldn't. How do you see these issues of the programs and the importance and maintenance? Could you speak?
First, or shall I do it? Okay.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
It's okay. Bom, antes do mais, se me permitem, também como vocês disseram, parabenizar.
I'd also like to congratulate.
Palestrantes foram brilhantes, né? Eu não fiquei muito, sempre aprendo. Nós sempre aprendemos nessas coisas. E se me permitem, eu vou começar pela pergunta, só uma nota adicional ao que o Giovanni disse em relação à pergunta do seu ministro, porque
the question of the minister, because in reality, the issue is pertinent. I believe, and it's my personal opinion, of an in terms of these public opinions, like Giovanni mentions, given to the extension, the depth of the crisis, and the short space that we had to react, it was very hard to define very long-term policies. Like the minister well said, though, some of them we observed that the ideal would have been to do credit 10 years so that they could adjust their cash flows that would be more adequate to the retaking. But there are sectors in Europe that haven't even reopened. There are sectors here in Portugal, which, like tourism, which is fundamental, that practically is not working at all. These necessarily. This is what I call an adaptive policy, to have an evolution of the thing. I don't deny that at a first moment, very few people would admit that the end of the pandemic as regards sanitary restriction wouldn't have finished. So even though we had to adapt the economy and the policies, we would have had to do it in a situation that in 6 months we would supposedly be working normally again, which didn't happen. So this adaptation had to be done, that some of us, through experiences in other crises, I was the president of the credit guarantee associations in the financial crisis 2008, 2009, and was very deep, even though more diluted over time, but with other characteristics. And I learned at that time that you couldn't do short-term credit. So these credit lines, just for you to have an idea, Portugal as an example, we had a system of guarantees around 3 billion euros. You saw 110 billion. So we had 2-3% of total of the European. Now we have 10 billion, and we've grown brutally. So we're talking a gigantic dimension. And I can say that the loans are for 5 years or more. 4 is the minimum. So since the beginning, we gave a very long term because we had a lot of difficulty. We had to do a lot of restructuring in the previous crisis to avoid what Stefan mentioned, an economic problem on top of a financial problem that creates another financial problem. Because if the companies have to pay those loans immediately, and if they're not having revenue, you will have a immediate financial problem, and they will go bankrupt, and it would increase enormously. As you saw in the analysis that the OECD did, they saw in the statistics, Portugal was expected the most bankruptcies, but that we prepared. We set the time of those loans to soften that curve. But even at this moment, in the public discussion all over Europe and in Portugal as well, that it will not be possible to keep a level of default and bankruptcy very low, just with what we have. We will have to extend those loans. We will have to give them more time to generate revenue, because the pandemic hasn't finished for most sectors. We will have to give them time. And for a state, in terms of public policy, in terms of control, we have a TCU here. It does the same analysis you guys do. It's good for the tribunal to understand, the court to understand, because you wouldn't follow, of course, what the official policy was. But those that are generating, those policies on the ground, that they from now do some kind of adjustment to the law in terms of prolonging those policies and to avoid greater loss of public money, because those companies, those enterprises won't be able to pay. And this adaptation will have to be done. And it's connected to what Stefan mentioned, that this strong drop in liquidity will not be possible. And something that I've talked a lot here in Europe and in various forums. I have another position that has nothing to do with credit guarantees. I am a businessman myself, and I'm part of a startup fund of Europe in terms of technology. And there is a kind of myth at this moment in Europe and some Western countries that everything will have to be solved now because companies are very much in debt with capital risk, with problems of equity, and we will have to, and in terms of issues of solvency and capacity, so there is a problem. The total number of companies in terms of risk, capital risk or startup tax. So the equity problem or equity solution cannot be applied to millions of companies in Brazil or Europe, anywhere in the world. They will have to have a solution of which equities the rich countries that have a lot of money already forgiving part of the loans. In practice, they're injecting capital in that way. Those countries that don't have as much budgetary capacity will give some time to these companies to generate revenue. If it's not in 5, 4, it will have to be in 15 and 20, and to restructure their capital. But there might be other manners, but I cannot see how we're going to get out of this. These lines is a discussion we're having now in Portugal. It's a problem that will increase if it isn't well looked at by the politicians. This issue of the defaulting and insolvency, and would have catastrophic economic results, will generate one of the results that we tried a lot to avoid in the beginning. When you launch these credit liquidity by helicopter immediately, and this created a wave of unemployment. If these companies are break, you will have unemployment, assets will stop, and to restart will be harder. Of course, there will be bankruptcies. They will happen. And it's not only about modernization. Giovanni mentioned digitalization and modernization of these companies, including the smallest ones, is a guarantee, much helped by the fintechs and the practical of guaranteeing public. So, and what we're doing, for example, I would be traveling to Brazil, but it was more expensive, more complicated. But this is a phenomena that has come to stay. Thank you, and sorry for extending myself. Stefan?
Did you understand the question from our minister?
Yes, I did, thanks to the fantastic translators. So thank you for that. But the minister puts the most important issue on the table. That I think. And the way I would say it, we have successfully, I think, put our SMEs in a coma since the start of the pandemic, with all kind of help, financial deferrals, moratoria, other things, and that was extremely important. If that would not have happened, then the situation would be much worse. But now, I mean, we have the dilemma. If you withdraw the support from the coma patients all of a sudden, he might or she might die after all, but you cannot continue a coma indefinitely either. That's the choice that we have. And therefore, I think that it has to do, we need to do this in as much as possible a way that is not just putting the plug out. I mean, that there are countries that are currently withdrawing, let's say, the credit support, I can understand. Australia is stopping its wage support measures because the economy is doing better, and they think that they are able to do that. There is other countries where there is less room for fiscal policy that say, now is enough. I mean, now we stop doing it. I think that that's a legitimate kind of consideration as well. So there can be reasons at the moment, and many countries are doing that, to consider stopping the let's say liquidity support. But I think at the same time, and the minister referred to that as well, we can maybe think about what are we doing with these moratoriums, with these deferrals, where you have to pay back tomorrow, or can tax administrations or private creditors be helped to say maybe in 2 years' time that works as well? Because the difference between paying back next month or in 2-3 years is again a matter of life and death for a small company. And then next, but my two excellent previous speakers already said that we also need to look ahead again, also for coma patients. I mean, this digitalization and trying to help companies to better use that, I think, is as much an important issue for discussion in policies as credit guarantees alone. So we also have to look a bit over that issue of stopping now or not to make sure, including the equity question, of course, that we develop the right policy mix. So I think that Brazil has very sensible government in this sense in making these difficult decisions. It is as a whole in a coherent way, ensuring that we don't step out too quickly and that all our efforts are for nothing, and that we lay the basis for recovery in different ways for these SMEs that are the most important actors in the Brazilian economy as well as elsewhere. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Stefan.
Obrigado, Stefan. Now I'd like to hand over to Andrea to make a question. I'd like to congratulate. Rafael, I think we'll have to set up another meeting to discuss more deeply, because there are a lot to be learned. So the question I have, and what José Fernando mentioned, that in the context of Europe, they already had a robust credit system for good growth and sustainability in the guarantee system. Did you think this contributed to the reaction and that the COVID crisis went quicker and more, and you got things more right? I say this because we had to do these policies overnight, and we didn't have much time to think on the design of these policies, and this could generate a series of problems in these policies. But if we had a structure, like you mentioned, of a credit guarantee system that was already well designed, it's just an issue of increasing, amplifying it. And in the last presentation, something that called my attention, that Brazil was already in an economic crisis, especially a fiscal crisis. So in the context, the government doesn't have how to make available many resources, budget-wise. I think this increased the crisis. We didn't have a capability of reaction. And so how do you align in this fiscal issue and the cost of credit? The cost of credit in Brazil is very high, interest rates are very high, and to align with this response that has to be given so that enterprises are not exterminated. So these 3 points. How would be this issue? How was this experience in Europe? if you had the structure well formatted, the question of the fiscal crisis that we're going through in Brazil and how to conciliate it, and also conciliate it with the cost of credit. I think Stefan mentioned, or it was José Fernando, I'm confused, but an almost zero interest rates or almost none. So in the Brazilian reality, is almost impossible. This would become a government subsidy in a way. That's it.
Stefan, now you first.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister, for again the most important questions that are being asked. I think that what you ask is if countries that had credit institutions, but maybe also other institutional things in place before the pandemic were able to respond faster and more effectively. Yeah, that's and you ask a question about fiscal policy as well that I briefly will address. I think that the answer is, and that's what economists say too often, yes and no. And I apologize, but there is yes, I think, reasons to say that you're right in the sense that, for instance, and my colleague from the AECM will no doubt underline that as well, that after the 2008 crisis, there was a very large growth of new public financing support institutions, no matter if they were SME banks, they were the credit guarantee organizations. So in response to that crisis now 12 years ago, there were things being put in place which, with the pandemic hitting, were very well positioned. Absolutely, I think that's true. That helped a bit broader even than credit. Germany and Austria already had institutions in place for temporary unemployment, to paying salaries, furlough schemes, as they say in English, whereas other countries like the Netherlands used them 12 years ago, but then basically stopped them. Well, again, having these things in place helps to move swiftly. So there is, I think, things there. The very important one, and that's, again, something that needs to stay on the radar, is e-government. Digital government, the digitalization of government services, because I think that the countries that managed to respond the fastest in many cases were the ones that had invested in that digital infrastructure through which governments could very quickly identify these entrepreneurs need the money. So there was there again, if you want to, a path dependency, as you can imagine. That being said, there was fantastic work by governments all across the globe, also in countries where these infrastructures were not there. I monitored quite closely what happened in Brazil in March and April, and I found it totally impressive how rapidly the response was organized in Brazil. So I wouldn't want to take it that these pre-existing infrastructures are the only important factor. I think also the willingness to act in governments, like in Brazil, played an extremely important role as well. And then maybe briefly on the budget, on the fiscal policy element, yeah, there is of course large differences in fiscal policy room between countries, and that is reflected in how countries have organized things. And guarantees, of course, can be, assuming that it doesn't end up very badly, can be a relatively cheap way for governments to provide support compared to grants. I mean, obviously, there is, of course, a difference. So there is that to take into account. But again, I think, and the OECD latest economic outlook underlined that, is that the fiscal policy response across countries, including in those which had less large budget, was so much more accommodating, and that helped us in this crisis. Again, think of earlier crisis when we were all trying to economize. I think that we've now learned our lesson to do that differently, and that is a great given. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Stefan. So, I mean, this time it was me to be saved by the previous speaker for to a certain number of comments. But but I mean, of course, I fully agree with you. I mean that of course I would call it. I mean the governments and the countries with bigger pockets, of course, could act not only fast, but I mean define a wider range of policies. And naturally, I mean if you have a pile of money like Australia or Canada or Germany, naturally you can not only use credit with guarantees, which was used mostly by countries with lower income, even in the so-called developed countries like mine, like Portugal, but also, I mean, they can also bring into the table, of course, much faster and in a much easier way to take, labor policies and salary supports and stuff like that, and grants and equity and quasi-equity, and that was what it was observed all over Europe and across the globe, generally speaking. But regarding the question from the secretary and from Andrea, I changed now again to Portuguese, if you don't mind. It's okay. But I mean, a pergunta sobre se a existência de uma estrutura.
If the existence of a structure or a guarantee structure is good. I didn't discuss this a lot regarding the structures, regarding the fiscal measures, the fiscal policies outside the credit. I prepared my presentation focused on the measures regarding credit lines for the SMEs, the role of the guarantee institutions, their roles. Of course, we could be discussing this, expanding our chat, and maybe we should discuss this at another moment. Fiscal measures that were taken, they were very useful, and so and also the e-government issue is very important, how easier it became for the companies to have access to help and aid in the countries that had e-government. And so it's true that you have, regarding this subject, you have a compared development above the average, at least in the theoretical development, the classical development, the per capita GDP. The Brazilian economy is way more advanced when it comes to e-government than many other countries around the world. And we compare this to the per capita GDP. I'm not lying, as you know. I'm just observing Brazil. Brazil has advanced a lot, even because of the old issues, the inflation. Inflation allowed you to advance way more than other countries. And some countries are only arriving at your level now. And I believe that your capacity for quick response is very good, better than many countries, even European countries. But it's also true that the existence of the financial sector or a well-structured financial sector that you have in Brazil. And the issue is that the Brazilian banks, they are highly sophisticated, technologically sophisticated, and they don't lend to companies. As Giovanni mentioned, they don't lend to companies. They can be really sophisticated, but the money doesn't go back to the economy because of the risk levels, the levels of risk. They only prefer to lend monies to huge corporations and not to SMEs. It doesn't matter the reason, but Giovanni said, so it doesn't reach 50% of the economy. And before that, we have the bankerization or the banking, the presence of the access that people have to banks. And those people who go to the bank and ask for credit, as Giovanni mentioned, 50% of them, they receive a no as an answer. And this is the biggest issue. So if you are going through an emergency, you need, these things get even worse, and you need to change that. So if you have a credit guarantee structure, well-structured, working okay, totally regulated during a crisis, it's going to be better equipped to respond to the needs. So in my association of guarantee institutions, it's the smallest, okay? Because I was a part of the founding efforts of the others, and so mine is the smallest. And I do this because I love it. And so I was for 20 years the president of many of these guarantee institutions. But this is a society that had 10,000 clients that involved about 400 million euros. And now we have 4 billion and we have more clients. And in March of last year, we had to decide overnight. We and our colleagues from the other Portuguese guarantee societies, something that was about 50 million reais approximately. And so we did this, and we had 10 billion a year. And so what was possible? It was easy because we already have an automated system, an electronic system, and so we have no manual actions, no papers, and so we only had the system that was totally digital, and we sped up the process. We're going through a pandemic. We're not going to require this paper. This paper is going to take 24 hours, and so we have to respond if it's a yes or a no. We made the processes more agile, and so we started using digital signatures. And so in 3 months, we had all of these resources being invested into the economy because we were already going through this digitalization process. And so the guarantee societies, they were working together with the same model, the same models. The accounting model is the same for all. The electronic platform was the same, that was centralized in the public fund. And all of us that were private, we could only see our part of the platform. And so the Draw Garante, I only saw the part of Draw Garante. And the guarantee institutions of the North, they only saw those. But the platform was the same for all of us. And so the electronic control, the workflow to analyze the credit, and so we all use the same system. And so the state that controls the counter guarantee fund said, no, now I need to invest in the economy 5 billion euros in 1 month. Can you do that? Can you do that? I can give you a counter guarantee of 70%, and then you raise it to 80 and 90. But you need to use this money, and you need to invest in the companies and share the credit with the companies. Try to make your processes more agile, to transfer the funds. We had to do all of that. So the response, yes, Andrea. The answer is yes. We having a well-structured system with all of this organized. And I know this, and I also had many conferences with Sebrae. And I'm also a member of the Ibero-American Guarantee Institutions. And so Brazil is huge. Brazil is huge. It doesn't work like Portugal, because in Portugal I only have 4 guarantee institutions. So we need to have the same digitalized and electronic system. It's cheaper, it's better, it's more agile. And this is a topic that is evolving at the state level. And so we have the counter guarantees that were created by Sebrae. And we're going to be able to offer consistency, organizational consistency to the guarantee institution systems. And so they are going to evolve at different speeds, and also the managers, the directors, if they are more modern, if they are more competent. The second point regarding the fiscal crisis, of course, we see this in Europe. We see this in Europe, as Stefan mentioned. So those that had deeper pockets, they were able to do more and faster. Those who didn't have so much money as Portugal in Europe is not one of the richest countries in Europe. So we used more credit instruments to leverage the businesses because we have the experience. And I remember that when we had the financial crisis, it was not overnight, but in 3 years we tripled the guarantee portfolio. And at that time, even the OECD and also the European Union, the European entities, the European Fund. They said the guarantee institutions, they're going to have billions of default and problems. But in fact, the way we managed that, we knew the companies because we were close to the companies. Because in Portugal, we have guarantee societies that I have from the north to the Azores. I know my entrepreneurs. I know the business people, and so I chatted with them all the time. So in the end, we had a default rate like Santander, and Santander, okay, was working in Portugal, and it was the Espírito Santo Bank also. So we had a default rate that was fantastic, and we have proven that with an analysis we can do better, and also we can leverage the fiscal resources that are very scarce. In Brazil, for instance, if the GDP is growing 20% a year, you can grant money to everybody. And finally, about the cost of credit, yes. So the countries that have a higher interest rate, and so the companies are not going to be able to pay these high interest rates. And so in Europe, this is possible because, as you know, the Portuguese state, we offer credit at negative interest rates, and so if they don't pay zero, they pay 0.5%. And during the pandemic, we have an average interest rate of 1%. That was the normal. We are charging 0.25% a year. And so it's very low because the European Commission made us charge something. But it's cheap. It's cheap that you almost have free credit. But in fact, this is a macroeconomic issue. So if you have an interest rate at 20%, 30%, 10%, 15% is more expensive. And then it's going to be way more expensive.
Muito obrigado, então, José Fernando.
Thank you so much, Mr. José Fernando. We have gone over our time too much. I would have many questions, but we had some very interesting questions on YouTube. I'm going to try to forward these questions to you guys directly, but due to the time, we are now going to have to conclude. And so I would like to pass the floor to Thiago Alves, okay? Thank you so much for the opportunity, okay? Thank you. Thiago, if you could conclude the event for us. Thank you, Rafael. First of all, I would like to thank the leadership carried out by Minister André Luiz during this event. His leadership was very important, and he was the rapporteur of this surveillance in Brazil, and he is here participating. This is a great honor for us. And also, I would like to congratulate Andrea, Rafael Encinas for the organization of the event. It is very similar to a panel filled up with experts, and they were brilliant in choosing the experts, okay? So this webinar was very rich in terms of information and debate. We had a very good debate as well, and I would highlight the unprecedented nature of this crisis. And we also had a crisis of trust and reliability. Everybody was very unsure about the future. And so in the work that the TCU is doing, the assessment that we are doing, the design of the policy, we can assess the effectiveness, the efficacy, and the efficiency, the cost-benefit analysis, if we have reached the target audience, and if we solve the economic problem that the design was designed for. And the question asked by the minister goes right to the heart of the solution of the question. What did this policy guarantee the survival of the SMEs in Brazil? So it's useless to give them a deadline, and then after that deadline, they are not able to maintain themselves open. This is a huge challenge, and we are also going through the regeneration of our policy. And so everything is being analyzed, assessed, and we have been analyzing this month after month, month after month. And so the crisis was terrible for us in March of 2020, and many of the policies, they were defined with a deadline for 3 months, without having this perspective. When are we going to be able to go back to normal? And we were talking about the new normal. And after these 3 months, we extended. We had a new set of policies. And even by the presentations, they were complementing one another. Social protection policies for the most vulnerable segments of our society, the generation of jobs, and we had a very important program here in Brazil so that we could complement the salaries that were being paid. Also, credit for SMEs, and these policies, they have a direction for the most vulnerable part of our society. And so this is a characteristic that is important and that I should mention. And after the pandemic, we're going to continue that. We're still going through the pandemic, of course, but we had to get the lessons learned, everything that worked out, everything that was good for the sanitary emergency, everything that should improve after the pandemic. And I believe that this is a critical point for the work that we are doing, okay? And all the operations so that we can ensure credit for the SMEs in Brazil. And we had 3 presentations that were truly, truly brilliant. We had a debate that was a deep debate regarding the guarantee system that was carried out by Mr. José Fernando. He shared decades of experience with us. We already have a huge challenge regarding the work that the TCU is doing, establishing criteria, the best practices, everything that has been working well, analyzing the Brazilian reality. And we also discussed the counter guarantee, the importance that it has, the counter guarantee, the risk assessment that must be carried out. And this is something that we're going to have to discuss and analyze during our oversight work and the surveillance work, analyze the PRONAMP. We also have Mr. Stefan discussing a very comprehensive panorama regarding the responses to the crisis from an economic perspective. And so all of the policies in each of their phases during the crisis, the generation of jobs, the survival of the companies that we have to analyze. And I believe that a very, very important point for the Brazilian reality is the fiscal scenario. To what extent does the government have the capacity to respond to the crisis?
And a series of exceptions in our fiscal policies outside of the fiscal and budgetary rules. And in a certain way, this was the point that stopped the continuity of these measures in the beginning of 2021. We didn't have an authorization, a juridical emergency state for 2021. We took a few months to manage, to discuss politically this new regime, and to create the political conditions for an extension of certain of these measures, like in the PRONAMP, the permanent aspect of it, and this is an important point. And in the case of the credit, it's important because it's the guarantee comes as a cheaper solution and of lower risk to the government. We had a very intense in terms of fiscal subsidies after the crisis in 2008, 2009. We invested 500 billion reais in credit operations through financial subsidies, and this had a very high cost for the country. Like José Fernando mentioned, some macroeconomic aspects interfere a lot in the capability and the effectivity of a policy based on economic intervention or credit policies supported by the government. And now this is a point that André wanted to put forth, that we left this model in a priority form to a model of guarantee. And I think this is something that created a great learning here in the Brazilian reality. And Stefan's presentation was very rich in the sense it gave us a set of informations, the 15 lessons the OECD learned. And I thought the last message was very important. Don't throw away a crisis. Crises are opportunities. We have to use this learning process. And Giovanni brought a panorama of business in Brazil. These are fundamental, represent 30% of our GDP, 50% of jobs, and 99% of companies in Brazil. And it's a parcel of our economic activity that demands our attention and needs a very good diagnostic in how each sector of the economy was impacted. And this naturally will demand some kind of focus in the public policies that are designed for those PMEs. And an important point as regards financing, I think, which all brought it. It's no good having money and having a well-structured financial system. We have to attack these market failures that demand government actions, which is the asymmetry and the strengthening of trust between institutions. And maybe that might and to create trust, so that with that trust we can reduce the cost of credit, and this mechanism finance that is sustainable. We had a panel that was very rich, and certainly we'll have a great opportunity here of these small and micro companies. And I'd like to thank everyone that's following this event, all our colleagues from the TCU that organized this event. And that's it. Thank you to everyone. Have a good afternoon in Brazil. Probably still good afternoon in Portugal. I don't know where Stefan is, probably Paris. Have a good afternoon. Thank you to all. Thank you.